Hey, it's Mr. Peterson. Welcome back for another exciting episode of Cells and Parts and Pieces. Eukaryotic cells. What's the difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells? You got to know that. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells have a membrane that surrounds their organelles. Here's an example of a eukaryotic cell. This is an amoeba. And an amoeba is a single cell. Here are some plant and animal cells. And we're going to spend most of this time dealing with eukaryotic cells, plant and animal cells, and the similarities and the things that they have in common. If you look at these pictures of the plant cells and animal cells, so up here at the top, here's an animal cell. And down here is a plant. And if you look closely, I know it's all colored and an illustration, but if you pause the screencast and just look, you'll see that they have things that are quite in common. And it's kind of a mishmash of stuff until we start to kind of dissect the cell and look at some similarities and differences. These are just illustrations, and they're really oversimplifications of the crazy busyness that goes inside of cells. Here's an animal cell again, and you can see that it has some compartments that have different functions, and we'll talk about those functions throughout this screencast. But lots of different colors going on in here. Cells are not that color, but the author has done that just to separate one part of the cell from the other. We have these structures that are kind of sausage shaped, look like a bratwurst or something, called mitochondria. Mitos means thread, and so the first people who looked at them under the microscope thought they looked like threads. We have a cytoskeleton. Cytoplasm is the stuff that fills the cell, and the skeleton is made of some proteins that are going to help support the cell. A membrane, we've talked about those, the phospholipid bilayer, it's fluid mosaic. It has a nucleus full of DNA, chromosomes, organized into chromosomes. All eukaryotic cells have those going for them. Then we have this stuff called endoplasmic reticulum. That's a mouthful of stuff. And different kinds, rough and smooth. And just look quickly at the illustration there. You can see that the rough has little dots on it. And those are structures called ribosomes. And ribosomes can be attached in the endoplasmic reticulum, or they can be floating around inside the cytoplasm. So we have attached and free ribosomes. Here's a plant cell, and plant cells have these things in common with animal cells: the cytoskeleton, membrane, nucleus, mitochondria, cytoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, but they also have some other stuff. And you can, if you go back and forth, if you toggle back and forth here or take the slider back and forth, you can make some comparisons just looking at the pictures without knowing the names of things. One of the biggest differences is that they have a cell wall. It's made of cellulose. We'll look at that more in detail. And it provides structure for the entire plant, whereas animals have skeletons, whether it's a skeleton like ours inside of our body, or a skeleton like an exoskeleton in a crab or a lobster or an insect that's outside of it. Plants have cell walls. They also have chloroplasts. And chloroplasts have the amazing ability of catching sunlight and turning it into chemical energy. And they also have vacuoles. And we'll talk about the functions of all of these, not just the plant ones, but the animal ones as well. We start with the internal structure, and we call that the cytoskeleton. If you look at this picture over to the right, it's quite beautiful. It was created with some differential staining. What the heck does that mean? That means that different proteins were stained with different materials, just like when we've stained tissues with methylene blue or something like that. And it indicated where those proteins were. So we have the cytoskeleton, which does things like holds the positions and transports organelles around the cell. It provides strength to the cell, so it actually supports the cell. It's not just a bag of membrane. There's actually proteins that are acting like a scaffolding, holding the cell up. It helps in cell division, and it also aids in cell movement. Here's a cool movie that shows the epithelial membrane, the membrane of this particular epithelial cell. And look at the membrane moving. That's getting pushed about by the cytoskeleton as microtubules and cytoskeletal elements, that's a mouthful, as they move and push. This is sped up quite a bit, I think a couple hundred times. But it just shows that membranes are fluid and that the cytoskeleton can change and move and help cells get from one place to another. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about organelles that are involved in making and processing proteins. First of all, we have the nucleus, and the nucleus is this structure here in the middle of this particular cell. And that's where genetic information is stored, and that's really, genetic information is really instructions for proteins. So if we zoom in, they're not all centrally located. This one happens to be in this particular plant cell, but they usually are pretty obvious, and you've seen those underneath the microscope. Here's a quick look at a nucleus all by itself. The DNA would be in the center of the nucleus, and it's going to be organized in chromosomes, and that's second trimester all over it. You can see that there's some openings, and then on the other side, on the outside of this, there's also a membranous canal, and this is the endoplasmic reticulum. That's what that structure is. And these little dots, those are ribosomes, and we'll get to more of that in just a second. But often those canals or tubes are continuous with the nuclear membrane. Endoplasmic reticulum is involved in making proteins. And there's a couple of different types of endoplasmic reticulum and all kinds of stuff. It's a physical chemical environment. When we look at this picture, and this is membrane. All of this is membrane. And the same phospholipidy bilayer that we saw in cell membranes. It's the exact same stuff, except it's organized into something we call the endoplasmic reticulum. And there's a couple of different kinds of ER, rough and smooth. Rough does proteins, and smooth is involved in detoxifying things. The big builder of proteins are amino acids. And so kind of the story is we start with the DNA being stored in here. That's the genetic information. It gets converted into another molecule called RNA, and then that heads out to the ribosomes. So you can see these little dots that are studying the endoplasmic reticulum, and that's where proteins are built. So proteins get built, and then all of a sudden the proteins are stuck inside these membranes, and a little bit of more chemistry that goes on. They get packaged and shipped throughout the cell. So that's just a quick look at a couple of structures that we find in eukaryotic cells. Plant cells have a nucleus. Plant cells have endoplasmic reticulum. Plant cells have ribosomes. And we'll get to more about organelles in the next screencast.